A few months ago, a friend who had invested in stocks proudly handed me his phone. "This stock is up 47%. I made a great profit," he said. We sat down and did the math together. The look on his face changed instantly, because with that money, he could buy far less today than he could have 5 years ago. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just his mistake. It's a major misconception shared by millions of people living with high inflation, mistaking a rising price for real profit. So how do you know if you've actually made a profit? And here's the more important question. If we can't fully trust the inflation figures reported by the government, what do we have left? The answer is hidden in a place most people would never think to look: a sandwich. If this video found you, don't treat it as a coincidence. Our goal is to give you a completely new way of looking at the world. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
First, let's establish the core principle, because everything begins here. When you buy a stock, a piece of real estate, or even a cryptocurrency, you're not just buying an asset. You're also making an implicit investment in the currency that asset is priced in. If you buy a stock on your local exchange, you're tied to your country's currency. If you buy a stock on the US market, you're tied to the US dollar. Whatever currency the price is quoted in becomes part of your investment. Think of it like boarding a ship. Once you're on board, you also accept the ship's course. If that ship is slowly sinking, you'll slowly sink with it, even if you don't notice at first, because the deck still appears dry. Let's look at a simple example. Imagine you buy a property, and 5 years later its price has doubled. That sounds fantastic, doesn't it? But if during those same 5 years the country's currency lost more than half of its value, then in reality you haven't moved forward at all. You're standing in the same place, just with a different number on paper. It's like running on a treadmill. Your legs are moving, you're sweating, but the scenery never changes. This is where the real mathematics of investing comes into play. If the asset you bought isn't increasing in value faster than the inflation of the currency it's priced in, you're not making money, you're losing it, even if the number in your account keeps getting bigger. For years, investors in high inflation economies had a simple shortcut for estimating this: the exchange rate. If the local currency lost value against the US dollar, inflation usually rose by a similar amount, as long as exchange rates weren't being artificially controlled. There was an invisible but powerful connection between the two. By simply watching the exchange rate, investors could roughly answer one question: am I actually making money, or am I losing it? But in recent years, that relationship has weakened or even disappeared in many emerging economies. Once exchange rates began to be shaped by policy interventions, they no longer reflected real inflation. The investor's simplest compass suddenly stopped pointing in the right direction. Think of it like the speedometer in a car. For years, it accurately showed how fast you were traveling. Then one day, someone tampered with the mechanism. The needle still moves, but it no longer reflects your actual speed. You continue making decisions based on that gauge, and that's exactly where the problem begins. If the exchange rate is no longer a reliable indicator, only one path remains: calculating real returns directly against inflation. But this leads us to a second and even deeper problem. In many countries, there are significant gaps between the inflation figures reported by official statistical agencies and the estimates produced by independent research groups. In some cases, the difference reaches double-digit percentage points. A quick clarification: by independent research groups, I mean economists and analysts who operate entirely outside the government. They track prices in supermarkets and everyday markets on their own, then calculate their own inflation estimates using independent methodologies. These figures don't come from an official institution, but from voluntary or independent teams conducting their own research. This debate has played out all over the world. In several Latin American countries, official inflation figures became so controversial that international organizations began publishing their own independent estimates. Similar crises of confidence have emerged in parts of Eastern Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Wherever high inflation appeared, the same question inevitably followed: which number reflects reality? So who should an ordinary investor trust? Not an economist, not a statistician, just someone who wants to know the true value of their savings. This isn't merely an academic debate. For someone planning retirement, for a family saving for a child's education, or for anyone simply asking, is my money actually growing? This uncertainty has direct financial consequences. The good news is that this problem isn't unique to high inflation economies, and it isn't impossible to solve. The world has faced this challenge before and found creative solutions. The Economist magazine's famous Big Mac Index was born from exactly this need. Instead of relying solely on complex official exchange rate data, it compared the price of a single product, one manufactured to nearly the same standard around the world, to measure purchasing power across countries. It was simple, transparent, and has been taken seriously by economists for decades. But what if every country had its own benchmark, one drawn from everyday life? In fact, it could. And in this story, that benchmark wasn't discovered in a laboratory. It was hiding in one of the most ordinary things we hold in our hands every day, a sandwich. Yet this ordinary sandwich does something economically extraordinary. So why has such a simple observation never been turned into a practical method for measuring real returns? The answer is far simpler than you might expect, and once you see it, you'll never look at a price tag the same way again. For 4 years, I've been making the same observation. Whenever the price of a branded established sandwich shop goes up, almost everything else in my life seems to rise by roughly the same amount. Groceries, transportation, rent, they all increase with a surprisingly consistent rhythm. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was simply a pattern I happened to notice, rather than a real connection. Then I started writing it down in a notebook. Every month, I recorded the price of the same sandwich from the same shop, along with the other price increases I noticed that month. As the months passed, the columns began to move closer together. I dug into the mathematics and realized it wasn't a coincidence. When you hold that sandwich in your hands, you're actually holding dozens of prices you can't see. Think of it like an iceberg. What you see is only the small portion above the surface, while the real mass is hidden beneath the water, far from view. Think about it. The price of the meat depends on the cost of the feed used to raise the animal. The price of the bread depends on the price of wheat. The price of vegetables depends on the cost of fertilizer. The truck carrying the ingredients from the farm to the store depends on the price of fuel. The factory producing the packaging and napkins has electricity and natural gas bills. The shop's rent, the employees' wages, their uniforms, even the dishwashing detergent. All of these costs quietly find their way into the final price of that sandwich. But not all of these costs have an equal impact on the final price, just as every item in an official inflation basket carries a different weight. Because meat makes up a large share of the sandwich's cost, it is one of the strongest influences on the final price. Items like napkins or detergent account for only a tiny share. This is essentially what statistical agencies do as well. If rent takes up a large portion of a household's budget, it receives a larger weight in the inflation calculation. On its own small scale, the sandwich naturally follows the same logic. The cost you spend the most on has the greatest influence on the final price. In other words, a single sandwich brings together nearly all of the major categories found in an official inflation basket: food, energy, logistics, rent, and labor within one product, and in proportions that roughly reflect their real economic weight. The only difference is that you see just the final link in this long chain, the result sitting on your plate. Everything else is hidden inside the price. You can think of it like an orchestra performance. On stage, you may only notice the conductor, but behind that single movement are dozens of musicians playing dozens of different instruments. The price of a sandwich works the same way. You see a single number on the surface, but behind it, dozens of different economic instruments are playing together. Of course, one obvious objection comes to mind. Can the price of a single product really represent millions of different spending categories? That's a fair question, and the answer doesn't lie in the size of the sample, but in the diversity of the product's composition. Official inflation baskets also compress hundreds of different items into a single number. A sandwich, on its own smaller scale, serves a similar role as a condensed basket of costs. No one is claiming mathematical precision here, but when it comes to direction and magnitude, the consistency turns out to be surprisingly strong over the years. The calculation, unlike complex formulas, is almost embarrassingly simple. Step 1. Record the price of a specific sandwich from an established, branded chain at a chosen reference date. Step 2. Check the price of that same sandwich from the same chain today. Step 3. Divide the current price by the original price. The resulting number is an approximate real-world cost of living multiplier for that period. For example, if a sandwich that's sold for a certain price on your reference date now costs 3 times as much, your multiplier is 3. Apply that multiplier to the price of any asset you purchased on the reference date, and you get the answer to one simple question. How much would this asset need to be worth today for me to actually be in profit? Let's make this concrete. Suppose you bought a stock worth 100 units on the reference date when a sandwich cost 10 units. Your money was therefore equivalent to 10 sandwiches that day. Today, if the same sandwich costs 30 units, your multiplier is 3. How much is your stock worth today? Let's say it's trading at 250 units. Divide that 250 by today's sandwich price, and you get roughly 8.3 sandwiches. So 5 years ago, you had an investment worth 10 sandwiches. Today, you have an investment worth just 8.3 sandwiches. The number on the screen looks bigger, but in real terms, you've actually lost ground. You can think of it as a ruler. Inflation can seem like something invisible and impossible to touch, but the price of a sandwich turns that invisible concept into something concrete, a physical ruler you can actually use to measure it. But doesn't the price of a single sandwich shop get affected by regional differences or short-term fluctuations in meat prices? It does. But the solution is simple here too. Take the average price from several established sandwich chains, and much of that volatility smooths out. Instead of looking at a single data point, you look at several reference points. Random deviations largely cancel each other out, and this is where things get really interesting. Let's calculate the same reference period using official inflation data. When you compound the inflation rates from consecutive years, the resulting multiplier turns out to be surprisingly close to the multiplier derived from the sandwich price. Think about that. On one side, you have the massive system operated by statistical agencies, with thousands of surveyors and millions of data points. On the other, you have the price of a sandwich. 2 completely independent methods arrive at almost the same place. That doesn't mean the official data is wrong, quite the opposite. When 2 independent methods validate each other, it suggests that both are pointing in a direction reasonably close to reality. The real difference is this: the sandwich method is available to everyone, instantly, requires no specialized knowledge, and is completely transparent. You might read an official inflation figure months later in the middle of a report, but you can check the price of a sandwich today using the phone in your pocket. Maybe you're thinking right now, how original is this idea really? Actually, it isn't entirely original, and that doesn't make the method any less powerful. Quite the opposite, it makes the idea stronger. We talked about the Big Mac Index. Using a similar logic, some economists and journalists have been comparing coffee prices and even rental indexes with everyday consumer goods for years to measure the cost of living in different cities. Concepts like the latte index have even been seriously discussed in financial media from time to time. In other words, the human mind naturally turns to tangible, everyday reference points when trying to make sense of complex economic realities. The sandwich index is simply a natural, organic expression of that same human tendency. Every country and even every city could have its own kind of benchmark product. What matters is that the product sits at the center of everyday life and carries a broad chain of costs behind it. Could you think of such a reference product in your own city? Maybe it's a particular type of bread, maybe it's a cup of coffee, maybe it's the sandwich shop on the corner. The formula is the same. Find a product that people consume regularly, one with multiple components and easy access, and let the mathematics do the rest. But when exchange rates are being suppressed, another critical question emerges. If there were no intervention, what would the real or fair value of that currency against the US dollar actually be? One way to estimate this is to start with the exchange rate on the reference date when exchange rate pressure began. Then you adjust it for domestic inflation from that date to today. On the dollar side, you subtract the inflation of the US dollar. Think of it like a balance scale. On one side, you place the loss in value of the local currency. On the other, you place the loss in purchasing power of the dollar itself. The point where the scale should theoretically balance gives you the fair value exchange rate. Does this calculation give you an exact number? No. There is still a margin of uncertainty because which inflation figure should be used remains open to debate. But this is exactly where the sandwich index becomes useful. When you repeat the same calculation using the sandwich multiplier, two completely independent methods once again point toward a similar range. Instead of one supposedly precise number, you get a reliable range. And in investing, looking in the right direction is often far more valuable than pretending to have absolute certainty. Think of it like a weather forecast. A meteorologist doesn't tell you, tomorrow will definitely be 23.4 degrees. They tell you, expect temperatures between 22 and 25 degrees with a high chance of rain. You take your umbrella and choose your clothes based on that range. A fair value exchange rate calculation works in much the same way, not as one perfectly precise number, but as a reliable range. And that range is more than enough to guide your decisions. But there's another interesting and slightly uncomfortable question here. Does high inflation affect everyone equally? One observation put forward by some analysts is that certain large international institutional investors may borrow in local currencies using foreign currency-backed financing instruments, take positions in local markets with that borrowed money, realize their profits, and then move back into foreign currency assets. The critical point is that the local currency they borrowed isn't actually theirs. That means a decline in the value of that currency doesn't affect them directly. Much of the risk is effectively carried by the parties who lent them the money. Think of it like renting a car. If the value of the car falls while you're using it, that's not your problem. The car never belonged to you, you simply used it for a period of time. The person who owns the car bears the actual loss in value. Some large investors may be using local currencies in much the same way, as a temporary vehicle rather than a permanent risk. This should be treated as a difficult to verify, unconfirmed observation, not as a definitive accusation, but as one possible explanation. If this mechanism is actually operating on a large scale, such structures could potentially play some role in maintaining exchange rate pressure in certain countries. But presenting this as a single, definitive cause and effect relationship would be misleading. An economy is far too complex to be explained by the decisions of any one actor. The important question here isn't who to blame, it's whether ordinary investors understand this asymmetry and act accordingly. Large institutional players may be operating under different rules and with a completely different risk profile. You shouldn't make decisions according to their rules. You should make them according to your own real cost structure. And this is exactly where the sandwich index comes back into the picture. Now let's get to the most practical part. Let's do a simple exercise. On the day you buy an asset, note the price of a sandwich at a nearby established sandwich chain. Divide your investment amount by that price. You now have the size of your investment measured in sandwiches. On the day you sell the asset, repeat the same calculation. If the amount you receive from the sale can buy more sandwiches than the amount you could have bought on the day you invested, then you've actually made a profit. If it can't, then even if the number on your account has grown, you've actually lost money. You can turn this into a simple habit and even share it with a friend. Next to every investment decision you make, write down the price of a sandwich that day, almost like keeping a journal. 6 months or a year later, open that notebook again. Don't look at whether the numbers have grown. Look at whether the number of sandwiches your money can buy has increased. Over time, this small habit can become a reflex, one that grounds your financial decisions in reality. But does this method work equally well for every asset class? Not exactly. With instruments that generate income in foreign currencies or with highly volatile commodity investments, the deviations can become larger. The solution is to use the sandwich index not as an absolute measure of truth, but as a cross-check alongside official and independent inflation data. If all three, the official data, independent estimates, and the sandwich index, point to roughly the same result, your confidence should increase. If there is a large gap between them, that should be a signal to proceed with caution. I've been tracking this method for 4 years, and I haven't seen any major deviations. But that doesn't mean the method is perfect. When meat prices experience sudden, sharp shocks, for example, because of an animal disease outbreak or import restrictions, the sandwich index can temporarily diverge from actual inflation. That's why the best way to use this method is not as a snapshot of the economy at a single moment, but as a long-term trend indicator. There's another limitation as well. This method is useful for measuring consumer inflation, but it wasn't designed for more technical indicators such as producer price inflation, export prices, or liquidity movements in financial markets. In other words, the sandwich index isn't designed to replace an expert economist. It's designed for an ordinary person who simply wants an answer to a very basic question in everyday life. How much harder has life become compared with last month? And that's exactly why it can be so powerful. Because despite all these limitations, you now have a tool that requires no specialized knowledge, something anyone can test today, right now, in their own neighborhood. And in the middle of complex economic uncertainty, that's something genuinely valuable. The real power of this simple method lies in the fact that it isn't complicated. Anyone who has never studied economics or learned how inflation indexes are calculated can use the phone in their pocket to test their own purchasing power within minutes, simply by looking at the price of a sandwich. You don't need a university degree, a financial terminal, or a complicated spreadsheet. You just need to walk into a sandwich shop in your neighborhood. This approach doesn't force people to blindly believe official figures or blindly reject them. Instead, it provides a third independent reference point. If the official data says inflation is high while independent estimates say it's lower, the price of a sandwich gives you an intuitive and immediate way to ask a simple question: which one is closer to reality? On a larger scale, this method protects individual investors from confusing numerical growth with real profit. A stock you bought 5 years ago may appear to be 47% more valuable today, but that is no longer automatically a profit. It becomes a question that needs to be answered first. How many sandwiches was that investment worth 5 years ago? And how many sandwiches is it worth today? That single question could prevent thousands of investors in every corner of the world, in every economy struggling with high inflation, from fooling themselves about how much they've actually gained. And perhaps more importantly, this method takes financial literacy out of the university classroom and brings it into everyday life in a form that is tangible and visible to everyone. You no longer have to think of inflation as an abstract percentage. You can feel it in the changing price of what's sitting on your plate. There is also an intergenerational dimension to this. Our grandparents often try to explain inflation by saying things like, "Back in my day, bread cost this much." In a way, they were intuitively using exactly the same method, choosing a tangible reference point from their everyday lives. The sandwich index simply takes that natural human intuition and puts it into a more systematic and trackable framework. And this isn't just an individual advantage. It could also become a tool for broader social awareness. When people in a country can clearly see the gap between official figures and the reality they experience in their own wallets, economic discussions can move on to a healthier, more evidence-based foundation. At a family budget meeting, when making an investment decision, or even when negotiating a salary during a job interview, this simple reference point can provide a common language that everyone can understand without the need for complicated economic jargon. Perhaps the biggest economic truths aren't hidden in the most complicated formulas, but in the most ordinary things right in front of us. If a sandwich can tell you something about a country's economy more honestly than an official report ever could, then perhaps the real question we should be asking is this: how many other simple truths are we overlooking simply because they seem too ordinary or too simple to matter? The next time you hold a sandwich in your hands, you won't just be holding something to eat. You'll be holding a small, remarkably honest tool, one that can tell the real story of the money in your pocket. Some ideas are simply too big to fit into a single video. There are subjects we're working on right now that we haven't shared yet. In the next video, we'll explore one of them together. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and be among the first to see what lies beneath the surface.